Chapter 19 is covering the digestive system. Um, until now, we discussed several times that the cells need a constant supply of nutrients along with oxygen in order to provide them with um, the necessary elements to create the energy that they need for their everyday work. In addition, those nutrients will be used to manufacture all those components or those elements that are making out our body. So the nutrients and the oxygen are necessary not only for the metabolism, but also for the growth and repairing of the tissues. This is the overview of today's lecture. We will cover the organization of the digestive system. We'll describe the elements of the digestive tract. We'll also describe the accessory organs. We'll detail the digestion and absorption processes. We'll cover the control of the digestion and absorption, including the enteric nervous system and the hormones involved in that. We'll cover disorders of peritoneum, mouth and teeth, esophagus and stomach, intestines, both small and large, along with disorders of accessory organs. And we'll quickly cover also the aging of the digestive system. Please pause this lecture and take a few moments to review the learning objectives. So when we eat, our food comes in particles that are too large to be able to enter the cells. In order to be able to reach the cells and also to be used by the cells, they need first to be broken down into smaller components. And this process of breaking down of the nutrients is called the digestion. Once the particles are small enough through digestion, they will be transferred from the digestive tract to the circulation, to the bloodstream. And that process is called the absorption. Also, the circulatory system, once is passing to the cell the nutrients and the oxygen, will take from the level of the cells the waste products. In the digestion and absorption, we also have some waste products, and those will be eliminated to the outside environment. And this process is called the elimination. Very didactically, if we are looking at the digestive tract, we can split it, we can divide it into two groups of organs to be easier to understand their structure and their function. We have what is called the digestive tract. And if we look at it, this is a continuous muscular tube with different diameters and with different types of movements and functions that extend throughout our whole body. Begins at the level of the mouth, and over there the food is taken in, and it ends at the level of the anus, where the waste products from the process of digestion and absorption are expelled. And we'll detail each of the elements of the digestive tract. You can see it in the image, how it's positioned in our body. In addition to that, we have what is called accessory organs, and those are necessary for the digestion process. However, they are not a direct part of the digestive tract. They are not part of this continuous tube. And we'll define those also. I will start by describing the peritoneum. And peritoneum is that thin, shiny serous membrane that will line up all the organs of the abdominal pelvic cavity. It folds back from the abdominal wall, and you can see it in the image if you try and follow with me. Start at the top of the liver on the right side, and you can see that there is an orange line. Just follow with me that orange line, and you see how it lines up the entire anterior part of the abdomen, and it's called the parietal peritoneum. And it goes on the pelvic organs. However, if you look down, you can see in the inferior part of the image how it lives outside the urinary bladder. That means that the urinary bladder is extra peritoneal. It's outside the peritoneum. It's left outside. And it continues to line up the whole part that is the um, 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 cavity that contains the organs. It runs up. If you go posterior, it will run up to the level of the, you see the duodenum, and at the level of duodenum it folds on itself and it becomes the green line. And this green line is covering all the organs. It becomes the visceral peritoneum that it covers, and it's tight, applied to the walls of the abdominal organ. And you see that all the organs that are considered intraperitoneal will be covered into this green line. That is the second layer of the peritoneum. It's a serous membrane. So if you remember from the heart and the lung, we said that serous membranes are producing that thin layer of fluid. Depending on the cavity, there will be more or less space for creating this fluid. You can see that in the abdominal cavity, we kind of have a lot of space as opposed to the pericardial cavity and the pleural cavity. Those were cavities that had only a little bit of space, not that much. In the abdominal cavity, you see that there is kind of a lot of space and a lot of fluid can accumulate before any kind of physiological impairment, any damage to the function of the organs will be really observed. However, it's a serous membrane, so the abdominal cavity will have this tiny layer of fluid that is called the peritoneal fluid over here, and allows for the smooth movements and activity of those organs. You see that there are some organs that are left outside, and they are in the outside, just like the urinary bladder. They are on the outside of the peritoneum. You see the great vessels, the inferior cava and the aorta, the descending one, that are running in front of the vertebrae, the spinal cord. Also, the duodenum is left outside, and the pancreas. You see that the rest of them, the large and small bowel, stomach, and liver, are considered intraperitoneal organs. And that's important to know in terms of understanding how signs and symptoms of some conditions will develop based on this position. We also have some subdivisions of the peritoneum, and we'll start by defining the mesentery. So the mesentery is a double layer portion of the peritoneum, and it's positioned and shaped in a fan type of um, um, spreading inside the abdominal cavity. The main function of the mesentery is to be attached to the posterior abdominal wall, and you can see it as the yellow structure, the thicker yellow structure in the middle of the picture that kind of connects every single loop of large intestine. So it's attached to the posterior abdominal wall and expands and fans itself out along the on its long edge, and will be attached to the small bowel. And between the two membranous layers in the yellow area that you see in your picture, there will be the mesenteric vessels and nerves that will supply the intestine. Whenever we are looking at this similar area of the mesentery that will connect the colon to the posterior abdominal wall, and this is the way that the abdominal organs are connected to the abdominal wall through the mesentery. When we are describing the structure that is keeping the colon connected to the posterior wall, that structure is called the mesocolon. Also, if you look in the upper area close to the liver, you will see that we have another yellow structure that is called the lesser omentum. And this is a membrane that will connect and extends between the stomach and the liver. And by looking at this, you can see that it kind of it's dividing the abdominal cavity in an anterior part of it and a posterior one. However, it's not completely separated. There are ways of getting over there. But if you continue down from the liver to the stomach, you can see how the visceral peritoneum opens itself and covers around the stomach from the anterior and posterior side, and joins itself again at the lower border of the stomach and expands down into a structure that is hanging like an apron over the front of the intestines. And this structure is called the greater omentum. Let's describe now the structure of the digestive tract wall. Um, the digestive tract starts at the mouth and continues to the anus, and at the level of the esophagus, it becomes more tubular and has a complete continuation from one structure to the other, despite the fact they have different diameters in different areas. They also have in common the structure with small variations. They will share the same four layers throughout the entire length of the digestive tract. And please take a look at this image and start following with me from the inside layer. I will start with the most inside layer that is called the mucosa and is lining the tube's lumen. Lumen means the inside part, inside cavity of the digestive tract. And for what that matters, lumen is the inside part of any kind of tubular structure. So the lining is a mucous membrane that at the level of the esophagus and the level of the anus has a stratified squamous cell structure. And this is because at those levels, the function is to transport, is the transportation factor, and squamous stratified will help protecting deeper tissues and promotes this type of smooth functioning. However, at the level of the um, stomach, small bowel, and large bowel, the structure changes, and the mucosa will be made out now from out of simple columnar epithelium, and that's an adaptation to the function again, because at that level, the bowel is involved in the digestion and absorption of nutrients. In addition to that, those in the same structures that are involved in absorption and digestion and absorption, we have, in addition, some cells that are called goblet cells that are spread throughout the epithelium, and they are secreting mucus. And the main function of the mucus is to protect the system's lining and to promote this type of smooth movement throughout the whole system. Also, because this area is exposed to um, elements, to nutrients, or all kinds of particles that are coming from our outside environment, the body will have part of its protection system located over there. And in this level, we'll have the gut-associated lymphoid tissue, or GALT, that is involved in the local protection, trying to overcome the pathogens as the first line of defense. Under this mucosa, we'll have a layer of thick connective tissue, and that's called the submucosa. And in the submucosa, we'll have the blood vessels and some of the nerves, and those are the nerves that are regulating the digestive activity. Immediately after that, over the submucosa, we'll have a layer of muscle that is called the muscularis externa, and that's composed of smooth muscles. So the digestive organs will have an outermost layer that is called a serous membrane, or serosa, which is very, very thin. And it's made out of simple squamous epithelium because it's very thin, and will have over some areolar or loose connective tissue. And this membrane actually forms the visceral peritoneum also. Because we mentioned that the digestive tract has a muscular layer, it means that this layer probably has a function of movement, of mobility, and the gastrointestinal tract has a mobility of its own. The smooth muscle layer in the digestive tract is made out of two layers. It will have an inner layer of circular fibers and an outer layer that is made out of longitudinal fibers. Circular fibers will run around the lumen, while the longitudinal fibers are running along the length of the entire structure. Whenever a section of the circular muscle will contract, As a result of that, the lumen will narrow. And whenever the longitudinal muscle will contract, the organ will shorten. As a result of that will be a wave of circular muscle contractions that propels the food through parts of the digestive tract. And this is called a peristalsis. So there is a continuous alternation, which is rhythmic contractions that will allow the food to be mixed with digestive juices and will produce the fragmentation of the food and mixing of the food. And this is called as segmentation. A combination of the peristalsis and the segmentation will both produce the fragmentation of the food and allows for the digestion and absorption, and also will move this bolus, because right now the food is called the bolus, throughout the whole length of the digestive tract. Which of the following is the correct order from the outermost to innermost layer? A. Submucosa, serous membrane, smooth muscle, mucous membrane. B. Smooth muscle, serous membrane, mucous membrane, submucosa. C. Serous membrane, smooth muscle, submucosa, mucosa. Or D. Mucous membrane, submucosa, smooth muscle, serous membrane. The correct order from the outermost to the innermost layer is serous membrane, smooth muscle, submucosa, mucosa. We'll start now to describe different areas, different parts of the digestive tract with their organ, because some will contain more than just one structure, while others will be just one structure. And you can see here in this table is kind of a quick summary of the digestive tract, starting at the oral cavity in the mouth with the structures over there. The esophagus is the next segment, followed by the stomach. Stomach will open into the small intestine that will be continued by the large intestine that will open to the outside environment again, and we'll detail each of those. We'll start with the oral cavity. So the mouth is what we call the oral cavity, and it's where the digestive tract actually starts. It has a few functions, and that will be first to receive the food, and receiving the food and swallowing it is called ingestion. It also allows, through the help of the teeth, to break the food into smaller portions and make it the fragmentation process of the food starts in the mouth through a process that is called mastication or chewing. In the process, besides the teeth, we also use the tongue, the cheek, and the lips in the movement. Also, at the level of the mouth, we are starting the process of digestion by mixing the food with saliva. And saliva is produced by the salivary glands that are exocrine glands that are secreting saliva, their product inside the mouth. And we'll describe them when we talk about the accessory organs. And as I said before, it allows us to have control on the amount of food that will be pushed towards the throat and swallowed in a process that is called deglutition. Inside the mouth, we have the tongue, and the tongue is a muscular organ. It projects from the back of the throat, from the back of the oral cavity towards the front. Its main function is to aid in chewing and swallowing. It is our main organ of speech. And also, if you remember when we discussed the taste sense, is the organ that carries the taste buds. And through the taste buds, we can differentiate taste sensations as bitter, sweet, sour, or salty. Also in the mouth, we have the teeth. We have two sets of teeth. Every single one of us is born with two sets. The first one that starts in childhood is a set of 20 teeth. They are known as baby teeth, and as a medical term, we call them deciduous teeth. Deciduous means a structure that will disappear, will fall off at a certain time. Is similar to how we see some trees losing their leaves in the fall. So it's deciduous teeth. The complete set that we have as an adult, we have 32, and we can split them um, into different types of teeth. We have in the front, the anterior part of the oral cavity, we have incisors. After that, we have 4 of them on each jaw, upper and lower. We have the cuspids or the canines or the eye teeth. Those are the lateral incisors, and they are a little bit more pointy. Those are in the movies. Those will be the vampire teeth, and they are used for gripping and tearing the food. They are very well developed in all the carnivore animals, not that much in humans. After that, we have in the back of the jaws, we will start having the molars. And those are larger, they have a more flatter surface, and they are used for grinding. We have 2 premolars and 3 molars. And this is on each quarter of the mouth. So the first 8 deciduous teeth or the baby teeth are usually the incisors. And a little bit later will show up the cuspids and the molars. And I'm talking 4 deciduous up and down, the 4 incisors. After that will show up the cuspids, and the molars will start up to show up a little bit later. However, most of the toddlers by age 3 will have the whole 20 teeth coming out by then. Once the child is growing and their jawbones is growing together with that, there will be more space, will be additional space created for additional teeth. So around age 6, we'll start to see some baby incisors starting to be loosened up, and the permanent teeth will replace those. In addition, we'll see showing up around age 12 more permanent molars, and those that are the third molar, very much in the back of the mouth, those are called the wisdom teeth. At the structure, if we are looking at the structure of the tooth, you can see in image B on your slide, you can see how the teeth are located in the teeth sockets inside the jawbone. And you can see that it's called alveolar bone because it makes the alveolus, those sockets where the teeth are contained with their roots. So if we are looking at the tooth, you can see that it has an upper part that we can see at the level of the mouth. It's exposed outside, and this is called the crown, is what sits on the outside. And you can see they have buried inside the bone, under the gums, under the gingiva. That's how the gums are called in with a medical term, gingiva. We see that they have the root. If we are looking at the level of the crown, you can see that there are 3 layers. We have an outside very hard layer of calcified bone that is called the enamel. Under it, we have another layer that is called the dentin. And this is also calcified. However, it's not as strong as the enamel. Enamel is giving our teeth the strength for grinding and chewing on the food. And the third layer will be the pulp, which is the soft part of the tooth, where we have the blood vessels and nerves. So in addition, the teeth are capped inside those alveolar bone by what is called the periodontal ligaments. Some ligaments are holding them in place, and they are the connection between the ligament and the tooth root will be done through what is called the cementum, some type of material that keeps the teeth well sealed in place. And you can see how at the bottom of those roots we have the artery, vein, and nerve that are entering through the root, and they're populating and they are feeding from the inside the tooth, and they are spreading at the level of the pulp. Now you can see that the dentin under the enamel is actually almost transparent. So the color of your teeth is given by the dentin. So even when we are trying to whiten our teeth a lot, we need to bleach the dentin. And to bleach the dentin, we need to have a substance that will be able to cut through the enamel and get to the dentin level to bleach it out. So when we are bleaching our teeth, in fact, we are compromising the enamel layer, and hypersensitiveness will show up at a certain point. Also, you can understand now how a cavity, the moment that comes very close to the pulp and touches the nerves, you start to feel it. You're not going to feel the cavities when they are superficial at the level of the enamel. And that's the stage when you want to catch a cavity and fix it, and not when it's going deeper at the level of the dentin or the pulp. Before starting and describing the stomach, let's talk with what structure lives and exists behind the back of the mouth. So the mouth actually will be continued by what is called the pharynx or the throat. And this is, if you remember from the respiratory system, that is the crossroads, is a combined pathway for both respiratory and digestive system that was made out of an upper part, the nasopharynx. We had the oral part, the oropharynx, and we had a lower part that was the laryngopharynx. Now, at the level of the oral cavity, the part of the pharynx is called oropharynx, and at the back of it, we have, in terms of structures that we see, there are the palatine tonsils, and we'll describe that. We described that actually when we talked about the lymphatic system. The soft palate is what continues the hard palate, the top, the roof of the mouth, and that is soft, flashy, V-shaped structure in the back that is called the uvula. Whenever we are swallowing, the tongue will push what is called now a bolus, um, um, a certain amount of food that was chewed and mixed with saliva into the pharynx in the back of the throat. Once the food is reaching the pharynx, the swallowing process starts very, very quick, and it's an involuntary reflex. And during this time, when we are swallowing, a few things happen. The soft palate and the uvula, and it's involuntary, it's not under our control. Soft palate and uvula will raise to prevent food and liquids from entering the nasal cavity. The tongue will raise to seal the back of the oral cavity, and the entrance of the trachea is covered by the epiglottis. As a result of that, there is only one way that the food can go, and that's through the pharynx and from the pharynx to the esophagus. The esophagus, and you see in your picture right here, you see the lower end of the esophagus. It's a muscular tube of about 10 inches long, roughly 25 centimeters. And its muscle structure, it's a little bit different than the other digestive organs. And this is because in its upper part will have voluntary striated muscles, while they change and are replaced by smooth muscles towards the end of it. At the level of the esophagus, there is a little bit of lubrication with mucus, but mainly there is the transportation of the bolus between the mouth and the stomach. And along this transport activity, not a lot happens to the food. It's pretty much a carrier tubular structure that connects between the mouth and the stomach. The esophagus will run through the length of our neck, the whole length of our thoracic cavity, and will pass through the diaphragm to join the stomach just under the diaphragm in the abdominal cavity. And the stomach will pass, and you can see it in the small square image on the left of your screen. You can see how the diaphragm will encircle the esophagus, and the esophagus is passing through an opening in the diaphragm that is called the diaphragm the esophageal hiatus. And it's important to remember this structure because whenever this opening is enlarged or is some kind of malfunctioning at the level of the diaphragm, we'll have a hernia, one of the conditions of the esophagus. Now you see that what continues the esophagus is the stomach. It has this kind of J-shaped structure, and it's positioned in the left upper part of the abdominal cavity, just under the diaphragm. What is a little bit different about the stomach, and you can see here, is that beside the mucosa, submucosa, and the serosa on the outside, the muscle layer, the smooth muscle layer of the stomach has an additional layer. And this is because the stomach is so important in mixing and fragmenting the food before it's passed over to the small intestine, which its main function will be absorption. The stomach main function will be to mix and process and make the food, break the food in smaller parts. So you see that the muscle layer of the stomach has three layers. We'll have the longitudinal outside, the circular now, it will be inside, I mean like in the middle part, and we'll have the inside one that will be an oblique layer. And this type of structure, because it has fibers in all kind of directions, will allow the stomach both to expand and to contract and to mix very efficient the food inside. At the level of the connection between the esophagus and the stomach, we have a structure that is a circular structure that is called the sphincter. It's called also a cardiac sphincter because it's very close to the heart. The heart is just near, the tip of the heart will be just near the stomach. However, they will be divided and not actually in touch. They will be divided by the diaphragm. So we have what is called the lower esophageal sphincter that will open and close periodically in order to be able to swallow. At the other end, where the stomach is connecting itself with the next part, which is the duodenum, at the beginning of the small intestine, we have another sphincter that is called the pyloric sphincter. And the end part of the stomach will be called the pylorus. We also describe two areas for the stomach, and you see that because it's this kind of J-shaped structure, we'll have a long or a great curvature on the outside, and we have a small or lesser curvature on the inside. We'll summarize now the digestion up to the level of the stomach, and let's see the events that happen up to this point. So the events in the mouth will be that at the level of the mouth, with the help of the teeth, tongue, lips, and the cheeks, the food will be chewed and mixed with saliva. The starch digestion, the carbohydrates digestion, which are an important and easy to use source of energy for our body. And because of that, the digestion will start very quick for our body. It will start at the level of the mouth. And we have in the saliva some enzymes that will start breaking down the starches and preparing them for absorption. And that is done by the amylase that is the salivary type. Once the food reaches the stomach. So if you remember, the stomach is kind of a pouch and a large structure that has a lining with a lot of folds, and those folds are called rugae. And the rugae, they will disappear whenever the stomach will expand, and that's one of the functions of the stomach. The stomach can stretch a lot to include a lot of food and liquids. In addition, the stomach in its structure will have a lot of cells that will secrete mucus that will allow for mixing and making the bolus and the food particles lubrified, meaning sliding a little bit easier. Also at the level of the epithelium of the stomach, we have some glands, and those glands will secrete what is called hydrochloric acid, which is it's a very strong acid. The pH is 1 and is produced in order to digest especially proteins. So the digestion of proteins, if the digestion of carbohydrates started at the level of the mouth, the proteins will start being digested in the stomach by the action of hydrochloric acid, in addition to an enzyme that is called pepsin. Pepsin is secreted in an inactive form. It's called pepsinogen. And what is activating it is the hydrochloric acid. So once I'm eating a full, rich, protein-rich type of meal, the hydrochloric acid will be stimulated. That will change the pepsinogen in the gastric juices into pepsin, increasing the ability of the stomach to digest proteins. Once I have a mix of gastric juice, mucus, and food in the stomach, now it's not called a bolus anymore. It's formed, and it will be called from now on chyme. This is semi-liquid, very, very acidic, highly acidic, and periodically the stomach will pass parts of the chyme from the stomach to the duodenum and the small bowel by opening, relaxing, and closing again of the pyloric sphincter. We are moving now into the next segment of the digestive tract, and this will be the intestines. And we'll have the small intestine and the large intestine depending on their diameter and their structure and where they are, but we'll start describing the small intestine that starts at the level of the pyloric sphincter. Once the pyloric sphincter is passed along the passageway, we have another segment that is called the duodenum. Duodenum is about 25 centimeters or 10 inches and it's called duodenum because it comes from the Latin word for 12, because they also, when people started many, many years ago in the antiquity to study our structure from inside, they observed the duodenum and they measured it and they saw that it has a 12-finger width. So that's how they decided to call it duodenum. Duodenum is the first part of the small bowel, and small bowel is called like that because it has a smaller diameter, and on an average the diameter of the small intestine will be about an inch, 2.5 centimeters. However, is very, very long. It's about 20 feet long. It's about 6 meters. Whenever it contracts, it's changing its length from 6 meters to 3 meters depending on the level of activity. The next segment of the small intestine will be the ileum. I'm sorry, the jejunum first, and after that the ileum. They are positioning more vertical or more horizontal. Jejunum is positioned in the left side of our body, and the loops of the bowel will be positioned a little bit more horizontal, while ileum starts to be towards the lower part of our abdomen and towards the right side, starting to connect with the large bowel, and they will be positioned more vertical. We'll look a little bit now at the function of the small intestine. The small intestine will secrete, will have a motility function, will be involved in digestion and in absorption of nutrients. So the secretion at the level of the small bowel starts in the duodenum and will continue throughout the whole length of it, also in the jejunum and the ileum. But the glands at the duodenal mucosa and submucosa will produce high amounts of mucus. And it's essential to do that because if you remember, at this level, the small bowel receives the chyme, and the chyme is highly acidic, has a pH of 1. So we need to have this mucus to protect the mucosa against any type of burn, any type of injury from this very acidic bolus. In addition to that, the mucosa in the duodenum and the whole length of the small bowel will produce enzymes that will finalize the digestion of carbohydrates and proteins, and also will secrete a lot of bicarbonate, which will neutralize the high acidity of the chyme coming from the stomach along the way of traveling through the small bowel. The function of motility. Remember that we have that type of movement that is innate, is present despite the control of my voluntary brain, that is called the peristaltis. So the motility at this level is mainly segmentation, will be this type of contraction, circular contractions that will allow for the mixing and fragmentation of the nutrients, allowing to be mixed with digestive juices, and also to come in contact with the mucosa that will allow for great level of absorption. The digestion, most of the digestion will take place at this level, and we'll discuss when we discuss the individual digestion of different types of nutrients because of the high quantity of enzymes and the high surface that is provided by the small intestine for the digestion and absorption. So we'll take a look in depth to the absorption at the level of the small intestine. The mucosa, in terms of structure of the small intestine, the mucosa and submucosa will form circular folds, similar with the circumvoluted one in the stomach that were kind of wavy. We have continuous round circular folds at the level of the small intestine. This mucosa of each of those folds is made out of millions of tiny finger-like projections, and those are called villi. And you have an example here of one of those villi. And by having those projections that are finger-like, the inner surface has this kind of velvet type of appearance, and it also increases the surface incredibly. It increases a lot the actual surface of absorption. Each of those villi will contain inside a capillary. And also, if you remember from the lymphatic system, we'll have a specialized lymphatic capillary too, not only the regular capillaries that are bloodstream, but also a specialized lymphatic capillary that is called the lacteal, that is in the middle. To make sure, it's another adaptation to the function, to make sure that all the absorption and the high quantity of absorption, it will happen at the level of the small intestine. Each of the epithelial cells of the villi will have even an increased area of absorption by projecting outside some folds that are called microvilli, and those will even more increase the ability of absorption. At the level of the small bowel, we absorb simple sugars as monosaccharides like glucose, small peptides, amino acids, fatty acids, nucleic acids, vitamins. Most of the water will be absorbed at this level through the capillaries. And from here, if you remember, all the blood that is drained out and it goes into the superior mesenteric vein will join the splenic vein and will be passed through the liver, making the portal vein that will run this blood through the liver to be processed or stored or released or filtered if needed. Fats and fat-soluble vitamins, however, will be absorbed into the lacteal, and by doing that, they will join the venous system through the lymphatic system. large intestine. The name large comes from the aspect of the diameter of this part of the digestive tract, which compared with the small intestine, which was in diameter about 1 inch and not bigger than that, the large intestine is approximately 6.5 centimeters or 2.5 inches in diameter. From the other point of view, the length of this segment is shorter, only about 5 feet long. So the fibers of this segment of the digestive tract will have a specific disposition, and especially those that are the longitudinal fibers will be concentrated in 3 separate areas, making an aspect that is visible from the outside, will make this kind of surface bands that are known as tinea coli, and this will produce a certain type of structure to the large bowel. The large bowel starts at the level of the ileocecal valve, and that's the communication between the ileum and the cecum. It starts in the right lower part of the abdomen, in the right lower quadrant. And if you take a look at the picture in front of you, you can see how the ileum opens through the ileocecal valve. That is a one-way type of valve, not allowing for reflux of the what is considered from now on waste products in the large intestine to flow back into the small bowel. Whatever is located under the level, if you draw a line through the ileocecal valve, a horizontal line through it, the organ that is the part of the large intestine that is located below that horizontal line is called the cecum. And the part that is located over the level of that horizontal line will be the ascending colon. So the cecum will have also a small opening that at that point that's where the appendix starts, and the appendix is a tube-like blind structure that contains lymphoid tissue. It's called the vermiform appendix, and vermiform means that it looks like a worm. The ascending colon starts above the horizontal line through the ileocecal valve and expands up to the level of the liver on the right side, parallels on the flank of the body, parallels the posterior wall of the abdomen, and goes up to the point where it bends itself and it makes up for the hepatic flexure. It will continue in a transverse way towards the left side of the body, just under the diaphragm and in front of the stomach. And it makes up for the transverse colon up to the point where it meets with the spleen. And at that point, it flexes, bends again downwards this time at the point that is called the splenic flexure. Now, because the liver is a little bit bigger and it occupies more space, you can see that the hepatic flexure and the splenic flexure, they are not at the same level. The splenic flexure is way higher because the spleen is small and there is more space to go up on the left side. At the level of the splenic flexure, the colon becomes a descending colon that will parallel and will run downwards on the left side of the body up to the point where it becomes the sigmoid colon, and it flexes in a form of an S. The sigmoid has its name from the sigma because it makes this type of bending that it's similar to the Greek letter sigma. And that happens at the level of the left lower quadrant. It will continue itself, the sigmoid will continue with the rectum, which is kind of a pouching type of structure, and it has inside a series of 3 valves, Houston valves, and the rectum will continue with the anal canal, which is very short, about an inch of structure that will open on the outside through the external anal sphincter. There are 2 sphincters at the level of the anus. We have an external one that is under the voluntary control, and we have an internal one that is totally involuntary. We'll discuss now the functions of the large intestine. Um, the epithelium of the mucosa of the colon, its main function is to produce mucus. It will this layer, this segment of the digestive tract will have no enzymes, and there is no digestion occurring anymore. What will happen, and maybe that's borderline digestion, we may say that there is some water absorption, and all that is left, the waste products, the undigested food, is temporarily stored, and it will be processed by the large intestine from what is a um, semi-solid type of waste product into a more formed, more solid waste material, and this is called the feces or the stool that will subsequently will be eliminated. The food waste will move through the large intestine through what is called mass movement. So the motility, it's a little bit, it's more segmented. It's in a larger waves than it happens in the small bowel. The movement of the waste products through the large bowel will be helped in a way by the movements of the diaphragm and by the contractions of the abdominal muscles. And this is very evident, especially in the process of elimination of the feces on the outside, with the process that is called the defecation. Um, at the level of the large bowel, we have also um, uh, there are some colonies of what is called the good bacteria that are helping our body to produce vitamin K and some of the B complex vitamins. And those are vitamins that we are not able to receive them through our diet. Which organ receives food flowing through the pyloric sphincter? A, the stomach, B, jejunum, C, duodenum, or D, esophagus. The organ receiving the food flowing through the pyloric sphincter is C, duodenum. We'll start discussing now the accessory organs, and those organs are producing secretions that are passed, that are delivered through ducts inside the digestive tract. So they are, in fact, exocrine glands. Those glands will be the salivary glands, the liver, in association with one structure that is attached to the liver, which is the gallbladder, and the pancreas. Um, Saliva is that watery solution that is used to moisten the food and will facilitate the chewing, the mastication. And by doing that, by moistening the food and making the food in the structure of a bolus round, will facilitate the swallowing, the deglutition. In addition to that, saliva is essential to keep the teeth and the mouth clean. Will be, if we are analyzing the saliva has some types of some antibodies and some enzymes that is called lysozyme. Again, if you want to remember that, Lysol is killing bacteria, so it's an enzyme that will reduce the bacterial growth in our mouth. In addition to that, in saliva, we have the salivary amylase that um, you remember that was starting the process of digesting the carbohydrates. We have three pair of glands that will produce saliva. We have the parotid gland that is the largest of the group, and it's located inferior and anterior to the ear. You can see it is the big yellow gland in your image. We also have the submandibular glands. They are called also submaxillary glands because of their position, and they are located near the body of the lower jaw. And we have the sublingual glands that are under the tongue. All those glands will produce and eliminate saliva through ducts inside the oral cavity. They may have one or more than one. The liver is a large gland, a large organ that is located in the upper right quadrant of the abdominal cavity. um, tight connected and attached to the diaphragm, under the dome of the diaphragm. And if you look at it, you can see that it has this type of almost triangular type of shape when you are looking at it. And the lower edge of the lobe, the one that is oblique, should not be felt under the lower end of the ribs on the right side. It has this kind of reddish brown color um, that is given because of the high quantity of iron and hemoglobin that can be found in the liver. It's made out of two lobes. We have the right lobe um, that um, it's way larger, and we have the left lobe that is located a little bit on the left side of the diaphragm. It crosses over the midline. Each of those lobes are further, from an anatomic point of view, we can split it in smaller um, segments. Um, the liver is supplied with the blood through two main vessels. We'll have the blood coming through the hepatic artery and through the portal system. When we are looking at those vessels, about up to 1.5 liters, about 1.5 quart of blood will be found in the liver, entering and leaving the liver every minute. While the hepatic artery is carrying blood high in oxygen, the venous portal system will carry blood that is lower in oxygen, however, it's very high in nutrients because it comes from it. The portal system is made up by the joining of the arteries coming from the small bowel. In terms of function, the liver has a multitude of functions. The first one that we can name here is to manufacture the bile, and the bile is needed for digesting the fats. It's also one of the main organs that contributes to controlling the blood glucose. And if you remember that, we discussed that when we were talking about the hormones and the insulin and glucagon actions. The liver will store the glucose in the form of glycogen, which is the equivalent of the starch, the complex type of molecules. The starch is found in plants, while in animals we found the complex type of carbohydrates will be the glycogen. And whenever the blood glucose is low, the glucagon will stimulate in the liver. The transformation will break out the glycogen to release glucose in the bloodstream, while when the levels of glucose are high in the blood, the insulin will stimulate the liver to produce glycogen, to synthesize glycogen in the liver. It also will store fat, iron, and some vitamins, will be the main producing organ for plasma proteins as albumin and globulins and the clotting factors. Also at the level of the liver, and you see how many functions it's actually covering the liver, will destroy the old red blood cells, and as a result of the destruction, there will be elements that will be recycled or other will be eliminated. And as a result of this, the destruction, the destroying activity of the liver on the red blood cells, there is a pigment that is called bilirubin. And this is eliminated with the bile and will give our stool the characteristics of a dark color that is characteristic to the stool. There is a waste product from the protein metabolism, and that is called the urea. And urea will be synthesized at the level of the kidney, at the level of the liver, and will be eliminated in the bloodstream to be carried to the kidneys, where it will be eliminated. And the last function, very important, however, function of the liver will be that of the function of detoxifying, removal of any type of toxic or harmful substances. And to give examples of that will be detoxifying alcohol or processing certain drugs and metabolizing them, inactivating them in order for the drugs not to be continuously working in our body. So I was telling you about the bile secretion. So, in the main digestive function of the liver will be the production of bile, and the bile is necessary for processing the fat. The fats, if you remember, they are similar to oil. Oil is a type of fat. So they are what is called hydrophobic. They will repel water. They do not combine well with water. And as a result of that, in the inside of our body, which is mainly water, those fats will gather into droplets, will become like round droplets. The bile contains some salts that will act like a detergent, will emulsify the fats, will break up those fats into smaller and smaller and smaller droplets, and those smaller droplets can be digested. The digestive enzymes can work on them easier. Also, the bile will prevent the products of fat digestion from becoming those droplets back, and by doing that, it encourages the absorption of them from the small intestine. The bile is produced in the cells of the liver and is collected by ducts. It's an exocrine type of secretion, and it will be collected by the ducts that will merge together to form what is called the common hepatic duct. Now, this common hepatic duct will join what is called the cystic duct, and the cystic duct connects the whole system with the gallbladder, and together will form from now on, from that point of those two ducts joining together, the duct that results will be called the common bile duct. The common bile duct will later join the pancreatic duct a little bit downstream and will be together, will go together for a very, very short interval and will open into channel that is called the hepatopancreatic ampulla that is closed by a sphincter that is called the hepatopancreatic sphincter. And this sphincter will control the elimination of both pancreatic juices or fluids and bile inside the duodenum. Before moving forward, I will say just a few words about the gallbladder, and you can see here a detail on how the hepatic duct is joining the cystic duct to become the common bile duct and to join the pancreatic duct later. So the liver is manufacturing the bile continuously. However, the body needs the help of the bile only during the times of the day when we are eating, when we are digesting. So as a result of that, this continuous stream of bile needs to go somewhere, and it will be collected through the cystic duct inside the gallbladder, which is just a sac. It's a muscular type of sac that lays on the inferior surface of the liver. Whenever the chyme will enter the duodenum, some signals will be transmitted to the gallbladder, and the gallbladder will contract while the hepatopancreatic sphincter will relax, will open, and the bile will flow inside the duodenum, allowing for the processing of the chyme. Now we'll discuss now the pancreas, and the pancreas represents this long gland that extends in between the spleen and the duodenum. It's located in the upper and middle part of our abdominal cavity. However, both the duodenum and the pancreas are what is called retroperitoneal organs. They are outside the peritoneum. The pancreas will produce enzymes, and those enzymes are needed for the digestion of fats, proteins, carbohydrates, and nucleic acids. All the pancreatic enzymes will be produced in an inactive form in order to not damage once they are produced. You don't want them to damage the own structure and tissue of the pancreas. You want them to be converted to active forms only when they reach the small intestine. And this happens under the action of other enzymes that are present over there. In addition to that, remember that the chyme is highly acid, and we are still very close to the stomach. We are still in the first segment of the small bowel after the stomach in duodenum, and the pancreas will release at the level of the duodenum very large amounts of sodium bicarbonate, which is very alkaline. It's very basic and will neutralize the acid from the chyme. And as a result of that, will protect the digestive tract lining. Probably remember from the endocrine system that beside that, the pancreas has also the endocrine type of activity through its islet cells that will secrete insulin and glucagon. We'll discuss now the nutrient digestion and absorption. In order for the nutrients, the food that we are eating, to become available at the level of the cells, the body needs to break it down to particles that are very small and very basic in terms of fats, proteins, and carbohydrates, so the cells will be able to use those. So the digestion and absorption will occur throughout the whole digestive tract. And I will summarize it for you. I will summarize in terms of where it happens and what happens in each of those areas. So if we are looking into that, we'll see that it starts with the salivary glands, where the amylase will transform the starch, part of the carbohydrates, into maltose, which is a more basic saccharide. We have the stomach after that, where under the activity of chlorhydric acid, the proteins will start the process of digestion. The hydrochloric acid will activate the pepsin from pepsinogen, and the pepsin will start digestion of proteins to smaller peptides. Once the liver starts to participate in the duodenum, the bile salts will emulsify the fats and will promote their absorption. The pancreas will neutralize the hydrochloric acid by sodium bicarbonate. The amylase in the pancreas will continue digestion of starch. The trypsin will continue the digestion of proteins to peptides. And the lipase will digest fats to fatty acids and monoglycerides. At the level of the small intestine at the level of the border, the brush border of the cells, they will have some enzymes also, and we have lactase, maltase, and sucrase that will digest these saccharides into monosaccharides. We'll analyze now the carbohydrate digestion and absorption, and you can see in the picture examples of what is a monosaccharide, what is a disaccharide, and what is a polysaccharide. So the polysaccharides, there will be glycogen for the animal storage, and you see that it's a molecule that is branching out, while the starches, the way that the carbohydrates are stored in plants, is a very linear type of molecule. Monosaccharides, you can see that we have three of them. We have glucose, galactose, and fructose. Those are the basic molecules, those that the body knows how to absorb them and the cells know how to use them. We have the disaccharides, and those are a combination of two molecules. We have maltose, which is a combination of two molecules of glucose. We have lactose, that is a combination of glucose and galactose. And we have fructose, which is a sucrose, which is a combination of one molecule of fructose and one of glucose. So the digestion starts, as I said, at the level of the salivary glands in the mouth and will continue throughout the small intestine. And what will contribute to that will be the pancreatic amylase and also the enzymes that are present at the level of the cell membranes in the small intestine. And we have specific enzymes that will break down the connection between the disaccharides, and will have maltase for maltose to glucose, sucrase for sucrose to fructose and glucose, and lactase for lactose to galactose and glucose. From this point of view, from this moment when those molecules become elementary monosaccharides, they will be absorbed into the villus capillaries. Remember the villi? So the villus capillary will absorb it, and it will pass through the um, capillaries into the venules, and into the from the venules that will branch in, they become the superior mesenteric vein that will make up part of the portal vein that will enter the liver. And at the level of the liver, they will be processed, they may be stored, or they may be released to the general bloodstream circulation if the body needs increased levels of glucose. Here you have the summary of what I described before. From a polysaccharide under the influence of amylase, they will become disaccharides, and we have three different types. Or they can become straight monosaccharides. At the level of the um, small bowel epithelial cells, they will be absorbed, they will be transferred to the villus capillaries that will carry them to the hepatic portal vein. We'll discuss now the absorption of fats. Uh, so a small amount of fat digestion may start in the mouth and may continue a little bit in the stomach. However, we are talking now about the main part of the digestion of fats that happens at the level at the level of the small intestine. So the fats that we ingest, most of them are in the form of what is called the triglycerides. And it's called the triglycerides because they are made out of the molecule of glycerol, and this molecule of glycerol has attached to it three fatty acids. The first step in digestion of the fats will be the bile that will emulsify the fats, and instead of having one big blob of fat, they will become tiny droplets. On those tiny droplets, the enzymes, the pancreatic enzyme that is called lipase, will start the digestion, the breakdown of the triglycerides into free fatty acids and monoglycerides. That is one glycerol with one fatty acid. So there, the lipase will break down two of the fatty acids out. Whenever there is no pancreatic lipase, the result will be that the fat absorption and digestion will be impaired, and a lot of the fats that are ingested will be eliminated as waste product just as they were. And as a result of that, the feces will be very, very oily. The fatty acids and the monoglycerides, they are small molecules, and they are able to diffuse inside the intestinal cell. Now, here something very interesting happens, because in the intestinal cell, they will be reassembled back. And this is done by the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. And not only that they will be reassembled back, but they will also be packaged, kind of will be a package deal. They will be packaged along with proteins. And those particles will be called kilomicrons, I'm sorry. And those are soluble in blood. And they're soluble because of the proteins. That it doesn't make things easier because the kilomicrons are very large because of this deal package, because they have so many molecules in them. And because they are so big, they cannot get into the blood capillaries, and they are absorbed by the lymphatic capillaries, the lacteals that you remember, they have bigger pores, they have bigger gaps in between their cells that will allow those big particles to be absorbed. And as a result of that, because the kilomicrons, they have a lot of fat in them, the lymph at the liver of the lacteals have this kind of milky appearance. The mixture of lymph and fat that will be drained out, will be transferred out from the small intestine, is called chyle. And the chyle will merge with the lymphatic circulation and eventually will end up into the bloodstream through the lymphatic drains in the veins near the heart. There are some fat-soluble vitamins such as vitamin D and E that needs to be absorbed along dietary fat. So whenever I have a condition that will have malabsorption of fats, those two vitamins that are fat-soluble, vitamin D and E, will also be deficient in those patients. We'll discuss now the role of water in digestion. Water, it's considered a nutrient, and the waters is added um, to the nutrient molecules while they will be processed by the enzymes. And in this process of breaking down the molecules by enzymes by adding water is called hydrolysis. And it means splitting lysis by means of water, hydrolysis. So each hydrolysis reaction will have its own enzyme that will catalyze it and will promote it, and will use one molecule of water. So about 7 liters of water are secreted into the digestive tract each day. And this is actually in addition to the nearly 2 liters that we need, ideally, to drink and take from the food and drink daily. So just by seeing that there is a need of about 9 liters of water in order to process the nutrients, and uh, they are involved in the process of digestion, you understand how essential the water is for our body. In just one system, you see how much water is used. And the water is used for producing digestive juices, to dilute fluid, and to produce the hydrolysis processes. Which enzyme digests carbohydrates? And the options are A. Amylase, B. Pepsin, C. Lipase, or D. Trypsin. The enzyme that digests carbohydrates is called amylase. We'll discuss now the control of digestion, and it has a few elements. It has more than one branch that is controlling this process. Um, you heard already that while the food is transferred and transported through the digestive tract, the rate of movement and the intensity of activity of each of the organs that are involved in this activity need to be in a way regulated. When, let's say, the move will move too slow, the digestive secretions are inadequate, the body will not going to get enough nourishment. In the same way, if the food will move too rapidly, or there is an in excess of secretions, also the digestion and absorption will be incomplete, and as a result of that, the digestive tract lining will be damaged. We'll look now into what is called the enteric nervous system. So the nerves that control the digestive activity, the end nerves, the terminations are located in the submucosa and in between the muscle layers of the organ walls. And it makes sense to be over there because they need to stimulate those muscles. These nerves form what is called a complete neural network and is called the gut brain, or the enteric, related to the um, gut's enteric nervous system. And it functions just like any other nervous system. It will receive stimuli, will decode the information, will analyze the information, and will provide a certain response to that. The information that is received from the um, digestive tract wall um, by expansion of it, or by contraction of it, will control the glands and the smooth muscles. We have the enteric nervous system is also under the control of the autonomic nervous system. And by doing that, the sympathetic will decrease the activity. Whenever we are in a state of fight or flight, the digestion is the last thing that our body needs to deal with, while the parasympathetic one, the one that deals with daily activity, will improve and promote the digestion's activity. There is also a type of hormonal control of digestion. And we'll discuss it in a second. It's just summarized here um, in this table, but we'll describe it in the next slide. And you can see here how we have some pathway of controlling digestion. In fact, our body is prepared for digestion even before the food will reach a certain part of the digestive tract. Just by the sight, smell, thought, or taste, and even by feeling the food in our mouth, that will stimulate through an autonomic nervous system the secretion of the saliva from one point of view, and also it starts secreting and elimination of gastric juice. And this makes sense because it's called an anticipatory or a feed-forward control. It means that my stomach needs to be ready to start processing immediately the nutrients once they are reaching the area. So once in the stomach, the food already starts to be processed by the hydrochloric acid or the pepsin. In addition, the food will stimulate a release of a hormone that is called gastrin in the blood. And the gastrin's main function is to promote the motility and the secretion, will increase the movements and the secretion of the stomach. Now we are moving forward. The chyme was released, was eliminated from the stomach inside the duodenum, and the volume, the expansion, is sensed by the receptors in the intestinal wall, and they will activate the nervous system, the local nervous system. So the first response that the duodenum will have will be to inhibit the motility of the small intestine. And by doing that, allow the food to not move too quick inside the small bowel, because the main digestion, the absorption takes place over there. So if the food will be passed through that tube too fast, will not going to have time to come in contact with the mucosa and be absorbed. So the chyme will stimulate the release of some intestinal hormones that reduce in response. I'm talking about the chyme being in the duodenum. The stomach now is empty. So I will need some information, some stimuli that will reduce the gastric motility, will stop the stomach from moving, and will also stop the acid production in the stomach, because the stomach now is completely empty. Each of those, so you have here in this graph each of those intestinal hormones and how do they work. So let's start with the glucose. So we have the chyme that reaches the small intestine, and the glucose is stimulating the release of what is called gastric inhibitory peptide. As a result of an increase of this hormone, this will stimulate the insulin secretion from the pancreas. And an increased insulin secretion in the pancreas will increase the glucose absorption, first of all, from the chyme, and secondary, the increased glucose usage at the level of the cells. If we are looking at the acids, amino acids especially, those will stimulate the release of a hormone that is called secretin. And the secretin will produce an increased pancreatic bicarbonate secretion that in response to that will buffer the acids coming from the stomach. Fats or proteins will increase the release of cholecystokinin, and cholecystokinin will increase the secretion of pancreatic enzymes and the bile release to increase the fat and protein digestion. And you can see how at a certain point all those loops will close themselves just in a negative feedback. our appetite and hunger, which are two different things, have a certain control in our body. And we know how to define both the short term and the long term type of control over our hunger. So when we are looking at the hunger is the desire for food. Um, and this the hunger can be um, just satisfied by having a meal, any type of meal, any type of food that will kind of fill the stomach, increase the blood glucose, will satisfy this feeling of hunger. And we have a different type of aspect that is called the appetite. And appetite differ from hunger on the fact that is the desire for food. And keep in mind that is the desire is not the need for food. So um, the appetite may not be related to hunger. You may have an appetite for something even when you're not hungry, and you may not gonna have an appetite for eating even when you're very, very hungry. So the appetite is related to a variety of factors, such as emotional state or cultural influences, or habits or memories, or even chronic conditions may change the appetite of a patient. The hunger, however, is regulated by some um, hypothalamic centers. And those centers will respond to a certain level of nutrients. And when I say nutrients, most of the time it's the level of glucose. I was telling you that there are two mechanisms of regulating the hunger. We have a short-term and the long-term regulation. Let's take the situation that we are fasting. So the blood glucose is low. The hypothalamus centers is perceiving the low level of glucose um, and will induce the hunger sensation. While the opposite situation, when we are full, the same center will feel the sensation for um, the hypothalamus will feel the sensation of um, being full and will stop us from eating by canceling the feeling of hunger. There is a hormone that the stomach, when it's empty, is releasing outside and stimulates also the hypothalamus center, and is called the ghrelin. So hypoglycemia will stimulate the hypothalamic hunger center, and also the ghrelin will do the same thing. To inhibit the signals, the food or the filling of the stomach, but the stretching, the distending of the walls will send some signals that will send some signals to the same hypothalamic center that will decrease the hunger filling. The long-term regulation is not that much a long-term regulation of hunger, um, is because of its components and because of the timing, we call it the long-term relation of body weight more than just hunger. Now, in a healthy individual, despite the fact that we have a variation in the amount of food intake and in our physical activity, we do maintain a constant body weight, and we have enough energy reserve, usually in the form of fat, um, most of us for very long periods of time. There is a hormone that was discovered, and it's called leptin. Leptos in Greek means thin. And we know now that the levels of leptin are very strongly correlated with the amount of body fat, with the regulation of weight. This hormone, leptin, interesting enough, is produced by adipocytes, by the fat cells. Whenever I have a fat storage that is increased because I'm eating too much or I'm not moving enough, the cells will start to release more leptin. And the centers in the hypothalamus will respond to this hormone by decreasing the food intake and increasing the energy expenditure. And as a result of that, we maintain the weight. We are not gaining the weight because we gain a little bit, we'll lose it back, so we kind of stay in the same range. Whenever this mechanism, feedback mechanism is disrupted, we'll have patients with obesity. And we know by now that every patient that has obesity, and especially the super obese, will have impaired level of leptin and an impaired mechanism of regulating the hunger centers. Let's review now the mechanism of regulation of hunger and appetite. And we'll start with the ghrelin, and we'll start with the initiation of hunger. An empty stomach will produce ghrelin that will be released in the bloodstream, will reach the hypothalamus center, and will stimulate the hunger center. As a result of that, by feeling hungry, we are looking actively for some food, we eat, and the food will fill and expand the stomach. Now let's see in the next slide what happens once the stomach is filled. Once the stomach is filled and the food starts to be released into the duodenum, cholecystokinin and the gastric inhibitory peptide will be released. In addition to that, if you remember, the gastric inhibitory peptide will also stimulate insulin release, and as a result of that, blood glucose will be absorbed and will be in the bloodstream and will reach the hypothalamus again. And as a result of that, all of them, the glucose, insulin, cholecystokinin, and kinin, and GIP. Now let's see what happens with the long-term regulation. If you remember, this hormone that is called leptin is produced by the fat cells the moment that they reach a certain amount that is pre-established in their genetic code. And the fat cells will release this hormone that is called leptin that is released inside the bloodstream. It reaches the hypothalamus and is telling the hypothalamus there is enough storage, there is enough energy stored. Right now, you're either eating less or you're moving more, you're expending more energy in order for us to maintain the balance. And as a result of that, in a normal individual with normal levels of leptin and normal functioning response of the hypothalamus to leptin, in some of our super obese patients, the hypothalamus is resistant to the influence of this hormone. The weight is maintained at a normal level. In those that are having they're having this type of super obese type of conditions, the hypothalamus, it's either the leptin is not produced in enough levels or the hypothalamus is not responding to the action of it. Which portion of the autonomic nervous system inhibits digestion? A. Somatic. B. Parasympathetic. C. Sympathetic. Or D. Visceral. The portion of the autonomic nervous system that inhibits the digestion is the sympathetic nervous system, the one responsible for the fight or flight reactions. We'll start discussing now disorders of the digestive system, and we'll go in a very organized way, going pretty much by each of the structures that we described before. And in terms of types of disorders that we can see in the digestive system, we have infections, we can have cancer, we can see structural abnormalities, we may see mechanical, nervous, chemical, or genetic malfunctioning or disorders. We'll start with peritonitis. Itis is inflammation, and the peritonitis is the inflammation of the peritoneum. And it can be a very serious complications that usually is following an infection of an organ that is covered by peritoneum. It can be any organ inside the peritoneal cavity. Any type of irritation, inflammation of peritoneum will give the same symptoms, signs and symptoms in the patient. The most common one, however, is the appendix. Nowadays, we diagnose this in very um, um, incipient stages, and only very seldom we have severe cases of appendicitis. In most of those initial stages of appendicitis, there will be what is called a localized peritonitis. Only the peritoneum in the area of the inflamed appendix will be affected. Whenever the appendix is, the condition is more advanced, and let's say, because we were talking about appendix right now, the appendix will rupture, an ulcer may perforate, we have maybe a penetrating wound, um, that will result in what is called a generalized peritonitis. Then the whole membrane, the whole peritoneum will be affected by inflammation. Usually, peritonitis is a straightforward indication for surgery in order to repair or treat the cause for the condition. Disorders of the mouth and the teeth. We'll start with the dental caries. Um, the dental caries, there are, for the tooth decay, um, they um, are as a result of a combination of factors. Is diet associated with heredity, a certain type of structure of the enamel, mechanical problems in terms of how that person uh, bite is, how are they chewing, and also endocrine disorders. They are most common in people that are eating a lot of sugar. Um, Baby teeth seem to be prone to this condition a lot sooner um, than the permanent teeth. Um, Definitely, hygiene is an important factor in preventing development of cavities. Um, any type of infection slash inflammation of the gums will be called gingivitis. Um, it can progress when treated not as it's supposed to be, or when it is ignored. It will develop into a secondary type of condition that can be seen as a complication of gingivitis that is called periodontitis. And in this one, the inflammation is not just the gums tissues, but also um, the supporting structures of the teeth, the ligaments and the bone that surrounds the roots of the teeth in place. As a result of that, the teeth will become loose, and there is also bone destruction that will be a reduction of the bone tissue that is able to hold in place and support the teeth. We have another condition that is called Vincent disease, and this is a special type of gingivitis. It's called by a bacillus, and it's common in teenagers and young adults. What we see when we examine the patient, we'll see inflammation and ulceration of the mucous membranes in the mouth. An infection with Candida albicans, which is a fungi or yeast, will result in a condition that is called oral thrush. In this kind of situation, when we examine the patient, we'll see this kind of creamy white lesions that will cover the tongue and the oral mucosa. And when you try to remove them, the oral mucosa easily bleeds. The treatment is with antifungal, and it's very easy. We just need to, and it can be done as local treatment or systemic treatment. Systemic meaning they are swallowing tablets with the antifungal, or local by swishing oral products in the mouth. Parotitis is an inflammation of the parotid gland. Commonly, we see that the most common type of infection will be the mumps, that is a viral infection. Mumps, in addition to the inflammation of the um, parotid gland will produce an inflammation of the testicles. They are also having the same type of glandular structure and may result in sterility. We nowadays don't see a lot of cases of mumps because we start vaccinating the children very early with what is called uh, MMR, which is measles, mumps, and rubella in one injection, in one vaccine. Disorders of the esophagus and the stomach. We start by talking about the hiatal hernia and the gastric reflux because they are uh, kind of related conditions. They can come in association with each other. Um, whenever there is a weakness in the diaphragm, the esophagus that normally needs to be situated um, under the connection between the esophagus and the stomach needs to be situated under the diaphragm may slide up, as you can see in image A, and part of the stomach may found itself uh, through the esophageal hiatus into the thoracic cavity into and developing into what is called the hiatal hernia. You can see here an example of a little bit of the stomach being pulled up inside the thoracic cavity over the diaphragm. However, those can be very big lesions. You can have a lot of the stomach, sometimes half of it can be over there. Remember that what we have in the thoracic cavity in that area is the heart mainly. So whenever I have an extra organ, especially an organ that periodically may uh, fill itself with fluids and food, will put pressure on the heart, and then the patient will have mainly cardiac issue. They will have palpitation or this kind of fluttering kind of feeling, will not gonna feel well, especially after they are eating even small quantities. So this is translated for the patient into sometimes different degrees of discomfort after meals. They may have inflammation of the mucosa of the stomach, which is called gastritis, and leading sometimes to even ulcers. Whenever there is a second type of situation that just the lower esophageal sphincter is weak and opens or it's not closing properly, we have a condition that is called the gastric reflux. Part of the very acidic um, content, composition of the gastric juices will backflow inside the esophagus. And if you remember, the esophagus has only one function, is able only to uh, move the bolus through it. It's not able to neutralize the highly acidic content um, of the stomach. The condition is called gastroesophageal reflux disease or GERD, and is characterized by intense heartburn that can be seen, can be felt extremely painful in some of the patients because it's an acid placed on a mucosa. It literally burns that area. Nausea and vomiting, not necessarily disorders. They are more signs and symptoms. We'll discuss them here, and they're associated. They can be part of different other conditions. They are not per se a disorder. Vomiting is also called in medical terminology emesis, and it represents the expulsion of the gastric content through the mouth, and sometimes it's even the intestinal content will be exposed out. Um, this is possible because the contraction of very strong contractions of the muscles in the abdominal wall that will forcibly will empty the stomach with an anti-peristaltic. Normally, the peristaltic waves, the movement of the digestive system will go one way. Um, in this case, an anti-peristaltic wave will be created towards the esophagus to aid in the propulsion. Um, Nausea is that unpleasant sensation of impending vomiting. It can have a lot of causes, and it's part of a lot of disorders. It can be a result of an inflammation or an over um, um, stretching, an over distension of the esophagus, the stomach, or the intestine. It can be a result of the irritation of the peritoneum. Sometimes nausea is associated with diseases of the vestibular system. diseases of the inner ear, in how it would, the nausea that is seen in the motion sickness. Some drugs will alter the activity of brain centers, especially those that are responsible for vomiting, and is the case of the chemotherapy drugs. And also in pregnancy, there is an increased um, nausea type of complaints, especially in the first trimester, and they are related to the um, overall overwhelming amount of hormones and the changes that happen throughout pregnancy. Stomach cancer, um, in the um, advanced um, medical uh, part of the world, um, those developed countries that are screening for stomach cancer, the cases of stomach cancer become lately very rare. However, the stomach cancer is still present, and it's a serious condition with high death rate. There is a higher incidence of stomach cancer in men than in women. Um, it will develop at the level of the mucosa, and because of that, is called an adenocarcinoma. In terms of signs and symptoms of this condition, we find out from the patients that they suffer for a long time for this type of what is called indigestion, a discomfort after meals. However, they were not extremely concerned, so they didn't consult a physician until the lesion was very big and was giving more symptoms than just that. The stomach cancer can have lots of complications, from obstruction to bleeding, to becoming a metastatic lesion, um, with early discovery of the lesion and surgery. The results can be very satisfactory. Gastritis and the peptic ulcer are both um, in the same range of inflammation of the mucosa, and this is the type of inflammation that is not associated with infection. However, in a second that you will see how I'm going to contradict myself. However, let's start by definition. Gastritis and the peptic ulcer are the result of chemicals acting and producing the inflammation at the level of the stomach lining. And the chemicals can be a hypersecretion of the hydrochloric acid. It can be chemicals, nicotine, radiation, chemotherapy, um, um, drugs is aspirin and anti-inflammatory drugs, um, even spicy foods. And I was telling you that I will contradict myself in a second, because we see that there is an increased um, association between this type of inflammation and an infection with a bacterium that is called Helicobacter pylori. And this is a pathogen that normally lives in the mucosa of the pylorus and will stimulate the acid production. And in association between the hyperproduction of the hydrochloric acid and this pathogen, a lot of patients will develop ulcers. Uh, the peptic ulcer is the common one, and it's the what is called the gastric at the body of um, um, the stomach, but they can show up. Those ulcers can happen at the level of the duodenum as well. Again, duodenum is not part um, of the stomach. It's the first part. It's considered the first part of the small bowel. Whenever we identify H. pylori associated with gastritis or a peptic ulcer, the treatment is antibiotics for 2 weeks. The treatment of most of those gastritis and peptic ulcers nowadays are not surgical anymore for many, many years, since we started to use two types of medication. One is the proton pump inhibitors, and the second one is the histamine receptor blockers, both of them reducing the production of the acid at the level of the stomach. The pyloric stenosis, um, this is a condition that is very common, not very common, but it's seen mainly in infants, um, mostly in boys, that the child is born normal, And once they start eating, regardless if they are bottle feed or breastfed, um, at a certain point they will start to develop symptoms of vomiting, projectile type of vomiting immediately after they are having a meal. And this is a result of a rapidly progressive hypertrophy of the pyloric sphincter. Um, there is a certain um, genetic component because we see it as an aggregation of cases in the same families. If the father had it, it's a higher chance that the son will have it too. Intestinal disorders will have a range of um, conditions. We'll talk about inflammatory disorders, and I was kind of explaining to you about appendicitis, which is an inflammation of the appendix, is a result of obstruction of the appendix opening by usually a tiny piece of fecal material that is called the fecalith. And as a result of that, there is a hyperproduction and inflammation of the appendix, hyperproduction of the bacteria inside the appendix that will thrive over there and will produce the inflammation of the appendix. The signs and symptoms will be abdominal pain associated with loss of appetite, with nausea and vomiting. When we examine the patient, there is an increased pain in the right lower quadrant. The lab blood test will show an increased level of leukocytes as a sign of infection, and the treatment it is appendectomy either by open procedure or by minimally invasive techniques as laparoscopy. We are trying to perform the surgery and treat the patients as soon as possible to prevent a rupture and the spreading of the infection throughout the peritoneal cavity. In the same category of inflammatory conditions, we have a group, a cluster of two similar conditions that they are called inflammatory bowel disease. One of them is the Crohn's disease, and the other one is ulcerative colitis. They share a lot of elements in terms of um, signs and symptoms. Um, they start to show up to give the first signs in early adolescence and sometimes in young adults. And the symptoms include pain, attacks of diarrhea, weight loss, and rectal bleeding. What differentiates between them is the fact that one Crohn's disease will involve inflammation of the distal small intestine and sometimes the large one with a certain type of patchy lesions. The ulcerative colitis will produce inflammation and ulceration of the colon and rectum only. Both of them will have signs and symptoms of involvement of other systems. They will have joint involvement and other areas of the body involved because both of them, in terms of mechanism of production, they are autoimmune conditions. Celiac disease, also a digestive condition involving um, the small bowel. It represents the inability to digest and tolerate gluten. And gluten is a protein that is found in wheat, rye, and barley. Um, the people with celiac disease will eat those foods, and their immune system at the level of the small bowel will identify those as a high trigger. Uh, will The immune system will become extremely upset by the presence of this protein. It's highly antigenic and will produce a reaction, an immune reaction at the level of the small bowel. As a result of that, those patients will have attacks of diarrhea, followed by constipation, abdominal pain and bloating, and that will be exacerbated when they are consuming foods containing gluten. So there is a continuous inflammation of the villi in the celiac disease. And the treatment is it's kind of easy. The treatment is simply avoiding the gluten. The main problem, the main risk in the celiac disease is not that much the quality of life that is very low because those abdominal pain and bloating and diarrhea. It's the fact that by being hyper stimulated, the immune system at the level of the small bowel may transform into lymphomas at a certain point later in life if this condition is not treated. And the treatment, again, extremely easy, avoiding gluten. Um, the next condition that is presented here is the irritable bowel syndrome. And this starts to be a more and more common GI disorder. Um, it will be seen in young to middle-aged adults. It seems to be a little bit more common in females, and it has two varieties. You will have the irritable bowel syndrome D form, the one that manifests itself by attacks of diarrhea, and we have the C form, the one that is mainly based on constipation. The patients will complain of a very uh, um, considerable pain um, that will be released by either having a bowel movement as a diarrhea or constipation. Um, and once they have the bowel movement, the pain goes away like nothing happened before. The problem is that this type of patients will feel a lot of anxiety and frustration, and while this is totally non-life threatening, it lowers a lot the quality of life of those patients. And it is believed that the mechanism of production is a malfunctioning of the nervous transmitters uh, at the level of the neurons, the autonomic nervous system at the level of the bowel. Enteritis and gastroenteritis, those are two um, conditions that um, they are usually caused by a pathogen that can be a virus or a bacteria or a protozoa. And popular, we call that the patient had the stomach flu. It can involve the stomach, or it can be just located at the level of the small bowel. If it's involving the stomach also, it will be called a gastroenteritis. Um, in some cases, some chemical irritants may exacerbate that, and that can be alcohols and some drugs as aspirin. Diverticulitis. Diverticula is a small pouch that will arise, will um, develop at the level of the wall of the intestine, and they are very, very common at the level of the large bowel, the colon. And they're usually the result of low in fiber diets. Um, and when we have a large amount of the diverticula, the condition is called diverticulosis. When one or a few of those in a certain area will become inflamed, that can be with or without signs of bacterial infection, that is called the diverticulitis. Um, Another complication of diverticulosis, besides the pain and the constipation in most of the cases, will be the bleeding. Those diverticula, they are very sensitive, and sometimes hard stool may rub on it and produce what is called the rectal bleeding. The treatment is to encourage, prevent constipation and promote elimination by changing the diet and increasing the fibers in the diet and the water, along with stool softener, avoiding the drugs that will produce intestinal spasm, and by increasing the physical activity of the patient. We are continuing with our intestinal disorders, and we are talking now about diarrhea. Again, diarrhea, not really a disorder, not a condition per se, but a sign or symptom associated with some of the conditions. Um, Diarrhea is an abnormally frequent watery bowel movements. The main danger in a patient with diarrhea is the fact they may become dehydrated, and they are losing in this watery bowel movements, they are losing a lot of salts. And it's especially will be dangerous in extreme ages as infants or elderly. Um, it may or may not be associated with a pathogen. The constipation is just the opposite type of symptom um, when the patient is complaining of not having enough bowel movement. Now, the critical question here will be, what is the normal bowel movements? How many? Once a day, twice a day, once every other day? Well, it's a very large and a wide range of normal. What we are looking into when we are investigating constipation is to see a change in the bowel frequency. If someone had a bowel movement every day and now they're having a bowel movement every 5 days, that's clear constipation. However, if someone was used to have 2 bowel movements per day and now they have only one, that's definitely not constipation. And we have different types of constipation based on their mechanism of development. We have what is called the spastic constipation, in which the intestinal muscles are overstimulated. And as a result of that, the canal becomes so narrowed, and the lumen, the passageway through that part of the bowel, becomes very small, very tight. And it's hard for the feces to pass through it. And we have what is called the flaccid constipation, or atonic constipation, when it's the lazy type of bowel, where it's typical for the elderly that are, or those that are bedridden, because they are not really doing any kind of physical activity. The bowel will also be extremely, will not going to have the normal peristaltic. We have another type of conditions that are called intestinal obstruction. And as the name says, the intestinal obstruction is mainly due to some type of lack of ability for the feces to progress throughout the digestive tract. Based on their where they happen, which segment will be involved, or the mechanism of production, we have a few situations. We have one that is called the volvulus, and the volvulus is a twisting. You see it in the image, the B image, is the twisting of the intestine, and usually it happens in the sigmoid colon that can be more redundant, more floppy. It can be as a result of a foreign body or a congenital malformation. The treatment is surgical, and if not treated in time, it can be fatal because of the accumulation. Because if you look at the image, you see how this loop, once twisted around itself, will continue to fill itself inside the loop with the production, the secretions of the bowel, and will expand up to a point where the vascular supply will be compromised, and as a result of that, the necrosis will happen. We have another situation that is called an intussusception, and this is the slipping of part of the intestine into an adjacent part of it, and you can see it in type A. It's common in infants. It happens mainly at the level of the ileocecal valve, or sometimes in adults when there is a polyp that will pull in one segment into the other. And as a result of that, again, the vascular supply will be compromised. Those are situations that are considered emergent conditions that need treatment, usually surgical in most of the cases. Ileus is just the opposite type of intestinal obstruction, is the result of a lack of peristaltics or a lack of muscle contraction. Colon and rectal cancer. The tumors of the colon and the rectum are, you can find them among the 6 most common types of cancer that we can see in a developed country. They are, in terms of types of carcinoma, they will be adenocarcinoma. They start at the level of the mucosa lining, usually with a polyp that will start growing into usually benign, and then will develop into cancer if not treated in time. Those are malignant. They're not benign conditions. They are malignant, and usually we see them that are a little bit more common in men than in women. We have a wide range of ways to diagnose the colon cancer. Back in the day, we used to do that by performing X-ray with a contrast medium to enhance the image. Now we have colonoscopies and sigmoidoscopies. Those are procedures that with a flexible tube that has at the end of it a camera, we can look inside. Not only that we can diagnose, but we can also take a biopsy if we see a lesion and see if that lesion is benign or malignant. And also if there are small polyps, we can remove them by doing this kind of intraluminal, inside the lumen, inside the tube type of procedures. And you can see here two examples. Image A, this is an X-ray study with barium contrast, and you can see how nice we can see um, the whole length of the large bowel. Um, just to give you a little bit of orientation, where you see the letter C, that will be the cecum. A is the ascendant colon, H is the hepatic flexure, T is the transverse colon, S is the sigmoid flexure, T is the descending colon, um, G is the um, sigmoid colon, and you can see how long and floppy it is, and somewhere in the back will be the rectum. Um, B, your B image is an endoscopic image of the cecum, and in C you can see an endoscopic image of a colonic polyp. You can see how the uh, concentric um, folds of the mucosa are sitting over there, and you see how in the middle of the cavity is laying inside this polyp. Liver conditions. Um, First condition that we'll discuss is called cirrhosis, and represents a chronic condition um, in which the normal and active liver cells will be replaced by some inactive or scar type of tissue. The most common type is associated with um, alcohol drink in alcoholic patients, and is called alcoholic, obviously, cirrhosis. Uh, because the alcohol has a direct influence and damaging effect um, on the liver cells. As a result of the scarring of the tissue, there is an increased resistance to flow, and as a result of that, the patients will develop what is called portal hypertension that will damage even more the hepatic tissue and will obstruct the blood flow. As a result of this increased um, blood pressure in the portal system, the blood will back up in terms of pressure, and the pressure will be felt by veins, by other veins in the GI tract at the level of the spleen, in the level of the peritoneal cavity even. Um, the patients will come with symptoms of varicose veins, varices, in several parts of the digestive tract. Most commonly, they are seen at the level of the esophagus and stomach, and also the level of the anus as hemorrhoids. The jaundice. Jaundice is related to the metabolism of bilirubin. And if you remember, the bilirubin is that byproduct of blood cell destruction that is eliminated in the blood in order to be excreted as a waste product with the feces. Whenever there is a damage to the liver cells or a blockage in the way that the bile ducts will eliminate the bile, there will be a buildup of bilirubin in the bloodstream. And as a result of that, by not being eliminated, the bilirubin will not going to be eliminated in the feces. The stool, instead of being dark in color, will be very pale. Um, However, by accumulating in the bloodstream, it will show up as deposits in the skin or in the sclera, and they will show up as yellowish, and it's called jaundice. Um, Jaune in French means yellow. So the jaundice can be as a result of a damage of the liver, impaired ability to manipulate, to uh, uh, metabolize the bilirubin, or it can be the result of an overproduction, overdestruction, I'm sorry, of red blood cells, and that's seen in the newborns where the liver is being immature and is not able to efficiently deal with the amount of bilirubin that is produced. Hepatitis are the inflammation slash infection of the liver tissue. Usually it can be, we can see hepatitis that are toxic, are chemical, and we see those that are viral. There are 5 different types of viruses, A, B, C, D, and E, with the B type being the one that um, is transmitted by exposure to blood or body fluids. Type A is the typical uh, typically transmitted in fecal matter and through contaminated food and water. We do vaccinate for hepatitis A and B. Hepatitis C usually needs an infection with hepatitis B in order for this one to be able and develop. Liver cancer, it can show up as metastasis of other cancer and also can come as a primary tumor at the level of the liver. We'll discuss now disorders of the gallbladder and the pancreas. We'll start with the gallbladder. Probably the most common condition associated with the gallbladder is the gallbladder stones or the gallstones. The condition is called cholelithiasis, and those stones are made out of a combination of bile salts, mainly cholesterol and other calcium salts, and bilirubin. Uh, Depending on their size, they may just stay in the gallbladder and put pressure on it and create this kind of discomfort during and immediately after meals for the patient. Or if they are very small, they can dislodge out and lodge themselves again into one of the bile ducts and create obstruction. And as a result of that, jaundice and pain, and sometimes secondary infection. Um, in other situations, as a result of the presence of those gallstones, the patient may exhibit signs of inflammation of the gallbladder, which is called cholecystitis. Regardless what type of signs and symptoms and what the condition is, the treatment is similar, is the literally removal of the gallbladder by surgery. Pancreatic conditions. We have inflammatory conditions of the pancreas that is called pancreatitis, um, and it can be as a result of an activation of the enzymes of the pancreas inside the ducts and the action of the enzymes on the pancreatic tissue. Um, it's, it can be seen in as causes for that after trauma of the pancreas, alcohol abuse, in some drug treatments, the resulting infection, or tumors. There are 2 types of pancreatitis. We have the chronic one that has this type of exacerbations and it worsens over time, leading to a permanent damage. And as a result of that, the malnutrition, because the the pancreas is involved in the metabolism of fats, so the patients will suffer from malnutrition. And we can have the acute pancreatitis that comes suddenly. It's short-lived if treated. However, it can be a critical condition, especially if associated with other risk factors, and can be even fatal. Chronic pancreatitis can be a risk factor for development of pancreatic cancer. Uh, Now, that kind of connects us to the next type of pathology of the pancreatic gland, and those are the pancreatic cancer. Usually, because this gland and the way that it's situated in the body is very hard to diagnose those type of lesions before they are kind of extensive and the cancer is well established. So in most cases, the pancreatic cancer is fatal even in the presence of performing surgery and chemo or radiotherapy for the patient. Aging and the digestive system. By aging and with aging, we'll start from from the level of the mouth, the receptors for taste and smell will deteriorate, and as a result of that will be a progressive loss of appetite. Again, not the hunger, the appetite, the desire, and the perceived pleasure from eating. And as a result of that, we'll have a decreased enjoyment of food in the elderly. Um, that will be associated with a decrease in saliva production, a poor gag reflex that makes swallowing difficult. Most of the elderly will have tooth loss or poorly fitting dentures that may um, compromise even more the process of eating, making chewing difficult. Just the way that other systems will deteriorate, the activity of the digestive organs will decrease, and as a result of that, we'll have poor absorption of certain vitamins, poor protein digestion, will be a slowing of the peristalsis in the large intestine with the result of this type of habitual constipation. The digestive system tissues have a very high rate of replacement throughout our life. And while we are growing older, there will be a slowing of this process, and this will contribute to development of this type of digestive disorders as gastritis and ulcer and diverticulosis. And of course, you probably noticed that this is the system with the most cancers that will occur while we become older and older.